Morning mist hangs over the hills of southern Africa. Across the open plain, thousands of warriors stand in silence. Shields raised. Spears ready. No shouting. No panic. Just discipline. Then, the army begins to move. Not as scattered warriors. Not as individual fighters. But as one formation. One mind. One weapon. The enemy watches as the Zulu warriors advance. At first, the formation seems to be moving straight toward them. But then, something changes. The warriors on the flanks begin to disappear into the mist. Left. Right. Faster. The enemy commander suddenly realizes what is happening. The army is not simply attacking. It is surrounding them. And by the time the horns of the buffalo have closed, there is nowhere left to run. They did not fight like ordinary warriors. They moved like one living weapon. But the man who created this army was once an outcast. A boy rejected by his own people. A child who grew up with almost nothing. He would become a warrior. Then a king. And eventually, one of the most feared military leaders in the history of Southern Africa. This is the story of Shaka Zulu. Part 1, The Outcast. Before Shaka became a king. Before armies marched at his command. Before his name became feared across Southern Africa. He was simply a boy who did not belong. Shaka was born around 1787 among the Zulu people, in a region of southern Africa where power was divided between numerous clans and small kingdoms. His father was Senzangakona, a Zulu chief. His mother was Nandi. But Shaka's birth was surrounded by tension. According to later traditions, his parents' relationship was complicated by questions of status, custom, and political pressure. And from the beginning, Shaka's place in the world was uncertain. He was not raised as the unquestioned heir of a powerful kingdom. Instead, his childhood became marked by rejection. The boy was mocked, humiliated, and, according to traditional accounts, treated as someone who did not truly belong. For a child growing up in a society where family, clan, and reputation determined almost everything, being rejected by your own people could mean losing the foundation of your entire life. Shaka and his mother were eventually forced to leave. They moved between communities, searching for protection. But wherever they went, Shaka carried the same burden. He was the son of a chief. But he was not treated like one. He had royal blood. But no secure place in the royal family. And he had ambition. But no power. This was the environment that shaped him. While other young men were learning what it meant to belong, Shaka was learning what it meant to survive. He learned to endure humiliation. He learned to observe people. He learned that weakness could be exploited. And most importantly, he learned that respect was not always given. Sometimes, it had to be taken. Years later, Shaka would build an army famous for its discipline. An army where hesitation could mean death. An army that demanded absolute obedience. But the roots of that discipline may have begun long before he commanded a single warrior. They began with a boy who had spent much of his life outside the protection of power. A boy who knew exactly what it felt like to be vulnerable. And perhaps that is why the man he would become would never again allow himself to be powerless. Before Shaka became the man who would transform warfare, he first had to survive being an outcast. Part 2, The Warrior. For years, Shaka had lived on the edge of power. He had watched chiefs make decisions. He had watched warriors prepare for battle. And he had learned what happened to those who were weak. But watching war was not the same as experiencing it. That changed when Shaka joined the Mthethwa kingdom under the command of its powerful leader, Dingiswayo. For the first time, Shaka entered a world where his abilities could be tested. The young man who had once been rejected now found himself surrounded by warriors. And he quickly stood out. Not because he was the strongest man in the army, but because he saw war differently. Traditional battles in the region often followed familiar patterns. Warriors would approach their enemies. They would throw spears from a distance. They might exchange insults. Then, after the fighting, both sides could withdraw. War was dangerous. But it was not always designed to destroy the enemy completely. Shaka began to question this. Why waste a weapon from a distance, when the battle could be decided up close? Why give an enemy the opportunity to retreat, when you could destroy their formation? And why fight as a collection of individual warriors, when an entire army could move as one? These ideas began to shape the way Shaka fought. According to later accounts, he trained his body to endure extraordinary hardship. He marched long distances. He fought without the protection of traditional footwear. And he learned to move quickly across difficult terrain. Whether every detail of these stories is accurate or not, one thing is clear. Shaka understood a fundamental truth about warfare. A weapon was only as powerful as the person using it. And an army was only as powerful as its discipline. He began to think beyond the individual warrior. He began to think about formations, movement, speed, pressure, and fear. The goal was no longer simply to injure the enemy. The goal was to break the enemy's ability to fight. And Shaka understood that this could happen before the final blow was ever struck. If an army could move faster, attack with greater force, and prevent its enemies from escaping, then numbers alone would no longer determine the outcome of a battle. This was the beginning of a transformation. Shaka was no longer simply learning how to fight. He was learning how to redesign the fight itself. And soon, he would begin changing the weapons in his hands. The traditional throwing spear would no longer be enough. The shield would become more than protection. And the warrior would no longer fight as an individual. He would become part of something larger. Something faster. Something more disciplined. Something designed to close the distance. And never let the enemy escape. Shaka had entered the army as an outsider. But he was beginning to understand something that would change the history of Southern Africa. The future of warfare would belong to the army that could control the battlefield. And Shaka was about to build one. Part 3, The Revolution in Warfare. Shaka had learned how to fight. Now, he began to question the way everyone else fought. For generations, warriors in Southern Africa had relied heavily on throwing spears. A warrior could attack from a distance, then retreat. The weapon was useful, but it had a weakness. Once the spear was thrown, it was gone. And if the enemy survived the first attack, the warrior had to fight with whatever remained. Shaka saw an opportunity. He introduced a shorter, heavier spear designed for close combat. Later generations would call it the Ikawa. It was not a weapon meant to be thrown. It was meant to be used at the moment when armies collided. When shields crashed together. When formations broke. When there was no distance left between life and death. The change was simple. But its consequences were enormous. Shaka's warriors were no longer encouraged to attack. And then retreat. They were trained to close the distance. To maintain pressure. And to stay in the fight. The shield also became more important. A large shield could protect the warrior. But in Shaka's system, it could also control the enemy. A warrior could use it to push an opponent aside, disrupt his balance, and create an opening for the short spear. The weapon and the shield were no longer separate tools. Together, they became a system. But the greatest innovation was not the spear. It was the way the army moved. Shaka understood that a powerful army did not simply need brave warriors. It needed organization. He developed a formation that became known as the horns of the buffalo. The center of the army was the chest. Its job was to engage the enemy and hold them in place. Then came the horns. Two powerful wings moving around the enemy's flanks. Their objective was simple. Surround the enemy, cut off escape, and close the trap. Behind them were the loins, the reserve. Fresh warriors waiting for the moment when the battle needed to be decided. From above, the formation looked like a buffalo preparing to charge. The chest attacked. The horns surrounded. The loins waited. And when the formation was complete, the enemy was trapped. The most terrifying part was not the first attack. It was the realization that the battlefield had already changed. The enemy believed they were fighting an army in front of them. But suddenly, warriors were appearing on both sides. The flanks were gone. The escape routes were disappearing. And the formation was closing. The enemy did not realize they were surrounded until the horns had already closed. This was more than a new tactic. It was a new philosophy of war. Speed over hesitation. Pressure over distance. Discipline over individual bravery. Shaka wanted his army to move as one body. Every warrior had a role. Every movement had a purpose. And every hesitation created danger. The result was an army capable of striking with extraordinary speed. An army that could force its enemy into close combat. An army that could surround a larger force and turn confusion into defeat. Shaka had taken the traditional battlefield and transformed it into a system. But the system only worked if the warriors obeyed. And that meant training, discipline, and absolute control. The man who had once been an outcast was now developing something far more dangerous than personal strength. He was creating a military machine. And soon, he would have the opportunity to test it on a much larger scale. Part 4, The Rise of the Zulu King. Shaka had spent years fighting under the banner of another ruler. But eventually, the past came back for him. His father, Senzangakona, the chief of the Zulu, had died. And with his death, the question of succession was suddenly open. Shaka was no longer simply a warrior serving another kingdom. He was the son of a chief. And now, he had a claim. But a claim alone was not enough. In the world Shaka had grown up in, power did not always belong to the person with the strongest argument. It belonged to the person who could hold it. And Shaka now possessed something his rivals did not. Experience, military authority, and the support of powerful allies. With the backing of Dingiswayo, Shaka returned to the Zulu. The boy who had once been rejected by his own people was coming back as a warrior. But he was not the same person who had left. He had spent years in military service. He had learned how armies worked. He had fought in battles. And he had developed ideas that would soon transform the small Zulu kingdom. Shaka took power. And suddenly, everything changed. The Zulu kingdom was not yet a great empire. It was relatively small. Surrounded by other communities, other chiefs, other armies, and other people who had no reason to accept Shaka's rule. But Shaka understood the problem. A small kingdom could be destroyed by a larger enemy. Unless it became stronger. Unless it became more organized. Unless it became something entirely different. So Shaka began to build. He reorganized the army. He strengthened discipline. He brought warriors into a more centralized system. And he transformed military service into the foundation of the kingdom itself. The army was no longer simply a force that defended the Zulu. It became the engine of the state. Young men were organized into age-based regiments. Warriors trained together, marched together, fought together, and increasingly, identified themselves with the kingdom that commanded them. This gave Shaka something extraordinary. A military force that could move faster, fight more efficiently, and remain under centralized control. The small Zulu kingdom was becoming something new. But this transformation came with a price. The more power Shaka gained, the more dangerous resistance became. A rival chief was not simply a political opponent. He could become a threat to the entire system. And Shaka had little patience for threats. His rule was built on loyalty, obedience, and fear. The same discipline that made his army so effective could also be turned against those who challenged him. As the Zulu kingdom expanded, more people were drawn into Shaka's growing power. Some joined willingly. Others were defeated. Some were absorbed into the new system. Others resisted. And resistance had consequences. The outcast had returned. But he had not returned to ask for acceptance. He had returned with an army. And the boy who had once been pushed away by the Zulu now stood at the center of their power. The kingdom was growing. The army was becoming stronger. And beyond the borders, new enemies were waiting. Shaka had won the throne. Now he had to prove that he could keep it. And to do that, he would unleash the military system he had spent years creating. Part 5, The War Machine. The Zulu kingdom was no longer simply a small chiefdom. Under Shaka, it was becoming a state built around military power. But an army could not be created by courage alone. It needed structure. It needed training. And above all, it needed obedience. Shaka organized warriors into age-based regiments. These units trained together, marched together, fought together, and lived under a system designed to create loyalty to the king and the regiment. The army was no longer a temporary force gathered for a single battle. It was becoming permanent, organized, centralized, and increasingly professional. The warriors trained to move quickly across the landscape. They learned to fight as formations. And they were expected to maintain discipline even under extreme pressure. The battlefield was no longer a collection of individual duels. It was a system. The chest, the horns, the reserve. Every part had a role. Every warrior had a place. And every movement was designed to create the same result: the destruction of the enemy's ability to resist. But this system had another advantage: speed. Shaka understood that an army that could move faster than its enemy had already gained an advantage before the battle began. His forces could appear unexpectedly, strike quickly, and force an opponent to fight before they were ready. For enemies accustomed to more traditional forms of warfare, this could be devastating. The Zulu army was becoming a weapon of mobility. But as the army expanded, so did the kingdom. Defeated groups were absorbed into the growing state. Young men could be incorporated into the military system. Local leaders could lose their independence. And the Zulu kingdom continued to grow in power. This period of conflict became part of the wider upheavals that transformed southern Africa during the early 19th century. Later historians would associate these conflicts with the period known as the Mfikane. But the causes were complex. Political competition, migration, economic pressure, the rise of powerful states, and the actions of multiple leaders all played a role. Shaka was one of the most important figures in this transformation. But he was not the only force shaping the region. And the consequences of this era remain debated by historians. What is clear is that Shaka's military system created extraordinary power. But power always has a price. The same discipline that made the army effective could become cruelty. The same centralization that created unity could destroy independence. And the same fear that kept enemies away could eventually turn inward. Shaka's rule became increasingly severe. Punishments could be brutal. Suspicion could be dangerous. And loyalty was expected to be absolute. The kingdom was becoming stronger. But the king was becoming more isolated. The machine he had created demanded control. And control required fear. Shaka had built an army capable of defeating enemies on the battlefield. But he had also created a political system where almost anyone close to him could become a threat. The man who had once feared being powerless now possessed almost unlimited authority. And that authority was changing him. The army had made Shaka powerful. The army had made the Zulu kingdom feared. But eventually, the greatest danger would not come from an enemy army. It would come from inside the palace. Part 6, The King Who Could Not Escape His Own Power. For years, Shaka had built his power through control. Control of the army. Control of the kingdom. Control of the people around him. But power does not always make a ruler feel safe. Sometimes, it makes every shadow look like a threat. In 1827, Shaka's mother, Nandi, died. Her death had a profound effect on him. The man who had survived rejection, exile, and years of warfare now faced a loss he could not defeat with an army. According to later accounts, Shaka's grief became extreme. The kingdom was forced to mourn with him. And the consequences were devastating. The exact details of these events are difficult to separate from later traditions and legends. But the broader picture is clear. After Nandi's death, Shaka's rule became increasingly unstable. His suspicion grew. His punishments became harsher. And the people closest to him began to fear the king they had helped create. This was the tragedy of Shaka's power. The system that had made him almost impossible to defeat also made it dangerous to disagree with him. Every rival could become a conspirator. Every disagreement could look like betrayal. Every person with influence could become a threat. And eventually, the greatest threat to Shaka came from inside his own family. His half-brothers, Dingain and Mlangana, had reasons to fear what would happen if Shaka continued to rule. The king had defeated armies. He had expanded the Zulu state. He had created one of the most powerful military systems in the region. But a palace is a different kind of battlefield. There are no clear formations. No open plains. No visible enemy. Only whispers. Loyalty can change in silence. And a man who has spent his life preparing for enemies may never know where the final attack will come from. In September 1828, Shaka was assassinated by his half-brothers and their allies. The details of the final moments are surrounded by historical uncertainty. But the outcome is certain. The man who had transformed the Zulu kingdom was dead. He had survived exile. He had survived war. He had defeated rivals. He had built a military machine that changed the balance of power in southern Africa. But in the end, he could not survive the system of fear that surrounded him. The king who had demanded absolute loyalty was killed by those closest to him. And this is what makes the story of Shaka Zulu so difficult to simplify. Was he a military innovator? Yes. Was he a powerful state builder? Yes. Was his rule also marked by violence, fear, and devastating consequences? Yes. Shaka was not a simple hero. And he was not simply a villain. He was a product of a violent and rapidly changing world. Who learned how to survive that world. And then transformed it. But the power he created eventually became larger than the man himself. The outcast had become a king. The king had become a legend. And the legend would survive long after the man was gone. Final, the legacy of Shaka Zulu. Today, the hills of southern Africa are quiet. The armies are gone. The shields have disappeared from the battlefield. And the men who once marched beneath the Zulu banner have become part of history. But the legacy of Shaka Zulu remains. He was born an outcast. He became a warrior. Then a king. And eventually, a legend. He transformed the Zulu kingdom from a small regional power into one of the most formidable states in southern Africa. He changed the way warriors trained, the way armies moved, and the way battles were fought. But his legacy is not simple. The same system that created unity also created fear. The same army that gave the Zulu kingdom power also brought destruction. And the same ruler who transformed warfare was ultimately destroyed by the political world he had created. History has remembered Shaka in many different ways. As a military innovator. As a ruthless conqueror. As a state builder. As a tyrant. And as a symbol of the power of one extraordinary individual to reshape an entire region. But perhaps the most remarkable part of his story is where it began. Not on a throne. Not at the head of an army. But as a boy who had been rejected. A boy who had learned what it meant to have nothing. And who eventually built a kingdom that the world could not ignore. Shaka Zulu was not simply a king. He was not simply a warrior. He was the man who transformed a people into a power. And turned an army into a weapon. And more than 2 centuries later, his name still echoes across the hills of southern Africa.